and welcome to North Harrow Community Library's series of virtual author talks. We'll be talking to a whole host of amazing authors and uploading those interviews right here to our YouTube channel. So please subscribe to us so that you never have to miss one of our videos. Today we'll be talking to Rhiannon. Rhiannon is an autistic freelance illustrator living and working in London. She is keen on collecting and documenting her everyday experiences with a focus on small details and soft colours. As well as being a brilliant illustrator, Megan has also self-published a book based on her experiences as an autistic person, existing autistic. This beautifully illustrated, beautifully written book gathers information, advice and feelings, and is an important read for people both on and off the spectrum. You'll also be able to borrow this book from the library right now. Hi Megan, it's lovely to be chatting to you today. So before we dive in a little bit deeper into your book, I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit about autism and what it is.
So put simply, autism is a neurodevelopmental disability, which means that how our brains are formed is different to those of people who aren't autistic. It primarily affects our cognition, so how we think and process things, how we communicate with other people and how we relate to the world around us. How we experience everything is different, primarily because our senses are heightened and we have issues with processing the input sort of in our minds.
There are lots of misconceptions and misrepresentations of autism in the media and in pretty much everything that we consume around us. What do you think are some of the main and most harmful misconceptions about autism and autistic people?
I think the most harmful misconception is probably the idea of what it looks like. After I did finally get my diagnosis when I was 18 and I started to tell people when I needed sort of accessibility at uni and stuff, it ended up coming out to my classmates. And a lot of people said to me, oh, you don't look autistic, as if it was a compliment. And it's not really, because if you've had to fight 18 years to find out that you have a disability that wasn't being supported and to finally have answers about yourself, it is by no means a compliment then for people to feel like they have to apologize to you on behalf of your existence in some way. So the idea of autism in the media time and time again is always just like a small white boy who likes trains, right? Like it's just a young boy who likes trains and other cliche things, or it's the older man who, like Rain Man, I guess, who has sort of savant abilities and is very gifted in math or science or something similar. And in reality, almost no autistic people are savants. It's a very small minority, sorry. And autism is incredibly diverse because it's a neurodevelopmental disability. It means that autism does not discriminate against race or age, or like it's anyone can be autistic. And so the fact that the media time and time again shows only the same looking person as autistic is very harmful, because it means that everyone's idea of autism is very narrow. And I think that's probably one of the most harmful stereotypes. And then I think the other main issue that we have as a community, an autistic community, is the idea of functioning labels. So the idea that when you hear the word spectrum, the image that's thrown around is like a linear spectrum, and it's a very short line, and it's just high functioning, low functioning, and then something in the middle maybe. But people tend to lump every single autistic person into either one extreme end or the other, which doesn't work at all, because in reality the spectrum is more like a spider web or like a star graph. It's not linear. There's too many traits, and the way your traits show on a particular day vary depending on what you've been coping with, and people's traits can change over time, and the stuff you struggle with depends on so many external and internal factors, that to lump people into the category of high functioning or low functioning is ridiculous, because some days are a lot easier than others. And a lot of the time the idea of high functioning is very false, because a lot of people say, oh, but you must be high functioning. And because they look at you and they think, oh, you can't be struggling with a lot. But just because you can't see what somebody is struggling with, or the things that they deal with, or how hard they're working to process the things you're saying to them, doesn't mean that those struggles aren't there. So time and time again, especially for the adult autistic community and for the late diagnosed, the idea of high functioning and low functioning is a very difficult misconception to constantly have to try and deal with, especially because a lot of people who don't agree with the idea of like the wider spectrum, and they focus harder on the linear spectrum, it's not always from a harmful place, but because they focus so hard on it, they tell you that you're high functioning to discredit your whole opinion on all of it. And then it's like it's an issue that feeds into itself then.
Mm-hmm. It feels like often lots of things, especially to do with neurotypical types of conditions are made out to be in the most black and white, or the simplest way possible. And that's, from reading your book, that comes across really clearly that is just not the case. And I think you do a really good job of very, very beautifully visualizing that spiderweb diagram as well, and as well as talking about it kind of with words. So yeah, very, very eye-opening. Also in your book, you kind of start off by saying that you really wrote this book for autistic people. What would you like autistic readers to take away from the book? And on the flip side, what would you perhaps like allistic readers to take away from the book? And maybe you could explain what allistic means first as well.
Yeah, allistic literally just means not autistic. It's just a word that the community uses just to very easily be able to say not autistic. It's just a lot smoother to say, I think. And that's what it means, just as neuroatypical means that you have a neurodevelopmental difference, and then neurotypical means that you don't. It's the same thing, but for autistic. The one thing, or I guess, so I wrote the book primarily for other autistic people, especially those who are maybe late diagnosed, or even who are just adolescents, young adults, or adults, because when I got diagnosed at 18, I was so relieved, because I had spent my whole life really struggling and not knowing why I was struggling, and because again, coming back to the idea of what autism looks like, because I didn't present typically, even though now when me and my family look back at it, I very much did, but because I was a girl born in the late 90s, they never even factored into the idea that autism could be what was causing so many of my issues. They focused on, I think, almost anything else that could be possible, but they just never considered a neurodevelopmental disability or anything even near that kind of umbrella of problems. So it was very isolating. My whole childhood was really hard, and then to find out at 18, and when I was at university, I felt really excited, because I was like, okay, uni's a great time to reinvent yourself anyway. So I was like, oh, this is great, because I can finally learn about myself and be myself and introduce myself as I was coming to find myself. But then I got home from my assessment and I found out that I was autistic conclusively, and I started looking for more information from adults, and it's a lot better now, but at the time, sort of 5 years ago maybe now, it just didn't exist, and that was really disappointing, because I had finally gotten my answers and I wanted to expand on that information, and there wasn't anything to expand with. I didn't find the comfort or the help or the resources or even just the information that I needed. So what ended up happening was I had to look at the information that's tailored towards very young children and their parents, and read a lot of that stuff, which when you're an adult comes across as very patronizing and quite sort of sinister or clinical, and in some cases even quite depressing, because a lot of the older views of autism are still very prevalent online. So I had to really sift through like a lot of awful information to find the bits that were still sort of accurate, and then I had to read the entirety of them and flip them to work out how that reflected in me as an adult. And then I did find the autistic community on Twitter, and that was really good, and that was really helpful, and I found a lot of comfort in other autistic adults. And so my motivation, long story short, for writing my book was to try and help other autistic young adults or adolescents or adults, no matter what age, hopefully find some more comfort a bit quicker. Hopefully they won't have to slog for it quite as hard as some of us did, especially if they are late diagnosed. That's already such like a scary time, and the frustration is already so high. The very least that they and we all deserve is then to be able to find the information that we need to start actually living properly. And then I guess for holistic readers, all I really truly want is for them to read the book with an open mind. I'm sure that some people potentially might watch this and see me and hear me talking and think, okay, forget this, it definitely can't be autistic. But that's kind of why I wrote my book, is because all of those myths need to stop, because autistic people already struggle with so much, that the fact that harmful misconceptions and stereotypes, no matter how well intended they are so damaging to us. And we desperately just need some more patience and some more kindness and hopefully some understanding. And so I just want holistic people to hopefully read it and to have an open mind, and just to remember that everyone is different and autism does not look the way they think that autism looks.
It was, reading your book, it was really, really wonderful to, and hearing you talk now, this idea that you had to work through so much to get the information you needed, and you just didn't want that experience for other people. I think that's such a beautiful reason to write a book and to put the effort into creating a book like this, sitting there with the illustrations and everything. You touched a little bit on your diagnosis, and your chapter on your diagnosis was really moving and very powerful. You write in your book that getting a diagnosis meant you had a compass of sorts to help you along. You touched on a little bit, but what does having a diagnosis mean to you?
So to go back to what I said earlier, to grow up without a diagnosis or to grow up disabled or autistic unknowingly is incredibly difficult. I'm not sure. It's almost like beyond words. You can't quite put into words how weird it is because it's neurodevelopmental, the disability. It means that it's almost your whole identity, which I know probably might not sit well with some people watching potentially, but it's true. Because it's neurodevelopmental, that means that your whole brain is autistic. Therefore, every act and every thought and everything that you do is autistic. There's no separating the person from the autism, which is why so many of us prefer autistic as opposed to person with autism, especially if you're late diagnosed or you're an adult. You had to fight so long to find out who you are that we almost covet the label in the end because it finally gives us what we need to be able to live. So then, after struggling so much for my childhood, and the diagnosis I wrote in my book is sort of skimmed over too. So you said it was quite moving, but I tried to keep it quite surface because there was a lot more to it than that too that was really hard for me. But I wanted to keep it sort of chalked up to the bits that were actually informative rather than go into like all of the depths of the stuff I went through. And I from talking to people online who have bought my book and then messaged me and sent me these really heartbreaking but also really beautiful messages about their experiences and how they felt seen in my book, and then they shared their stories with me. It's really like heartbreaking to know that my situation and all of the things I went through, even the unsaid things, were not singular to me. It turns out that it's all very universal, and the amount of suffering and misdiagnoses and abuse in some cases and bullying and basically all of the awful things that you can imagine a person would go through undiagnosed, we go through. And it's a universal experience. It's not just a couple of us who go through that. It seems to be so many of us. And so to go through that kind of stuff in your formative years and your growing years when you're so young and impressionable and you're trying to work out your identity sort of as a teenager and stuff, and to have no idea what's wrong, but to know you're different for so long, and to know that everyone in your life is misunderstanding you and no one knows you properly, but you don't know why, but deep down somehow you know that that's the case, and that you don't even know yourself. Like I don't know how to word it, but it's so big to deal with. And then to finally get the diagnosis it's everything. Like it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that my diagnosis saved my life. Like it gives you everything, because suddenly you have community and you can find support in other autistic people, and the resources are hard to find but slightly better now than when I got diagnosed, but the resources are partly there. You can find that information. I would take years of having to read all of the patronizing stuff for children and the parents to still get those answers than I would going back to the not knowing. Like diagnosis gives you the toolkit to move forward with your life, or to even just begin your life properly, because when you grow up undiagnosed for however many years, and in some cases you can get to 40 or 50 or 60 without knowing, and that I can't even fathom that because I only got to 18 and I almost didn't survive it. But then to have the diagnosis is how to start living, because before that you're just fumbling through, very confused, no instruction manual, a lot of misunderstandings resulting in a lot of hardship, and then to get diagnosed then is you can finally do something, I guess.
There seems to be a lot of sort of fight back or controversy about this idea of labeling or over labeling, which I feel normally comes from people who are not autistic. It's not their experience. And what would you say to those people who kind of think about having a diagnosis as kind of putting you in a box or kind of labeling you? What would you kind of say in reaction to that kind of narrative, I guess?
Well, for me personally, again, having grown up diagnosed and how hard it was and how confusing and disoriented and lost you feel your whole life, I am really glad to be put in a box. Please keep me in my box. I'm glad I finally found my box, because realistically, whether you like the idea of labels or not, everyone has one. Because even just allistic or neurotypical is a label, and you're lucky that you're the majority of society. You're lucky that you think you don't need a label because everything is catered to you. But when you grow up autistic, nothing is accommodated to you. Even if you grow up diagnosed from a young age, all you're taught is how to cope with a world that does not accommodate you. It's really difficult. So then to grow up undiagnosed and to have no idea, and then to finally get your label, it means that now you have the label to hold and to be like, okay, these are the accommodations I need and you owe them to me. And I don't think that's unfair to say, because we process things and deal with things differently. We can't function in your world unless people make accommodations. And a lot of the time, they're not even big accommodations. A few months ago, people would say that, oh, you can't work from home because meetings online is impossible. But the pandemic has shown a lot of people can work from home successfully. And hopefully, if companies realize that properly and sort of take accountability for that, it will open up the job market to more disabled people that have been denied it for so long. It's something as simple as that. The world assumes that autistic people sort of, the accommodations are too big and therefore they can't have them, and it's this horrible tragic story. But a lot of the time, the things we're asking for, the small accommodations we need to be able to function and thrive, are not that big of a deal. But society is so begrudging to move even 1 centimeter out of its rigid structure that I don't know, like, we need the labels, because without the labels we can't even get 1 centimeter of help or accommodation to be able to function and live our lives and you know, live. So yeah. And also, sorry, and then also for identity, there, like, your sense of self, that's really important, especially if you grow up undiagnosed. To have no identity and no true sense of self is very damaging. So then when you grow up and you finally find out you're autistic, you want the label, because you build your identity around the information that you now have about yourself. So especially for younger people, I think that's really important.
You talked through a couple of things in your book that was, you know, they were really eye-opening and really, really informative. And I was hoping that we could maybe talk about some of those terms, some of those ideas now. And these are terms that I think are often misunderstood or misrepresented, just in the media generally, just in our society generally, and especially is misunderstood by allistic people. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about masking and what that means.
So coming back to growing up undiagnosed again, because that's obviously my biggest frame of reference. Masking, put very simply, is the autistic, I don't want to say ability, because it's not, it's nothing about it is natural, but a lot of people struggle with it. Like, some people don't manage to learn it and pull it off, and I definitely don't think we should have to. I don't think masking should be a thing. But for me especially, because I grew up undiagnosed, and I went to normal school around all my peers and stuff, and it was really difficult. Masking is when you sort of subconsciously begin to mimic the behavior of others around you, sort of as a survival technique. For me, it wasn't something that I did deliberately. For some people it is. Some people can turn it on and off like a skill. I never intended for it to happen. I didn't realize I was doing it until I got a bit older, and, you know, it became more apparent and I was more self-aware. And then when I went to my diagnostic assessment, he explained it all to me sort of a bit more, and he was saying that it's the case for a lot of girls and women, especially who grow up undiagnosed, is that masking is an enormous thing, and that's why so many women and girls have gone undiagnosed for so long, and that's why we're seeing quite a big wave of very late diagnosed older women. So masking is sometimes voluntary, but mostly involuntary. It's where you reflect the behavior of those around you in order to try and fit in. So, for example, if you went to a job meeting, you would sort of plan what you were going to say in your head, and you would think, okay, I have to wear earrings and mascara because that's what girls do, kind of thing, even if you personally don't feel the need for it or understand it, because you know it helps you fit better. Even if you're not at a point where you know you're autistic yet, you know that you're probably different. And so you mimic what the people around you are doing to help you sort of fit in and to survive. I'm not sure if I'm doing the explanation justice, but it's almost a survival technique that's either voluntary or involuntary, where you just mimic those around you as a sort of sense of self-preservation. So some people are able to hone it as a skill and sort of use it to be able to function better among people, and that's cool if they're happy to do that. My masking was almost completely involuntary. I didn't realize what I was doing. And now, even that I'm diagnosed, because I've been practicing it for so much of my life, I find it really, really hard to turn it off, which is quite sad. Especially when I did get diagnosed, I thought, oh, this is great. I want to be myself now. I want to learn how to be myself, because I have never been myself before, because I didn't know what that was. And then I found out what it was, but I had been masking for so long that I can't seem to have any control over it. It just happens. And so a lot of my more typical autistic behaviors are done by myself at home, which then feeds into the whole idea of, oh, you must be high functioning. But it's like, just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Like, I went through a lifetime of horrible stuff and bullying and all kinds of things, and then accidentally learned this horrible technique of self-preservation, and now you're going to stand in front of me and tell me that it's great that I'm, you know what I mean? Like, it's really unfortunate. But the main thing about masking is that no matter whether it's natural or unnatural to you, or whether you learned it deliberately or by accident, is that the cost of it on the individual is enormous. Masking is absolutely exhausting. And especially if you have no control over it, that's a really horrible thing, because it means, for me especially, or for me personally, I spend a lot of time masking, and then I have to spend twice as long recovering from those hours. So if I spend 2 hours out of the house masking involuntarily in front of people, and then I come home, I would need 4 hours, potentially longer, to recover from that, because the mental strain of trying to uphold the mask, even if you don't realize you're doing it, is so great that it's like incapacitating. As soon as I'm away from people, I find that the mask like cracks off like a broken plate, and then I can't cope with anything. And I think a lot of autistic people find it the same. I've had my experiences reflected in a lot of my friends and people I've spoken to. So that's the problem, because I guess to maybe an outsider, masking might sound like such an ideal situation of like, oh, you're autistic, but you can do this thing, and then maybe you can get a job and have friends. But it's like the cost of it, I don't think many of us think it's worth it in a lot of cases, because if you mask for too long too, you then encounter burnout or becoming very unwell from the draining effects of it. Like it's really quite bad.
And talking about the kind of negative consequences and the flip side of masking, in your book you talk about meltdowns and shutdowns. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
So meltdowns and shutdowns are sort of like they're sort of linked. They're like two sides of a similar sort of like emotional, what's the word, like response. So a lot of us have sensory processing disorder. It comes hand in hand as part of the diagnostic criteria, and a lot of people who are autistic won't even think of it as a separate condition, but then some people seem to. But it's almost always a given in autism. The only difference is that I think some people can have a sensory processing disorder but not autism, but almost all autistic people experience sensory difficulties, if that makes sense. It's a big part of the diagnostic criteria, and it's a big part of our lives. So because of our neurodevelopmental differences, we struggle to take in and process sensory input altogether, but also at a speed that is sort of comparable to our peers. We think, it's not that we think slower, it's that we process slower, if that makes sense. So when things are too bright or too loud, we can't process those properly and we can't deal with them. And a lot of us have heightened senses as well. So things are much too loud, much too bright, fabrics are too rough, or they feel strange, and we can't think about all of that at once and deal with that mentally, and then to be able to form a sentence to reply in a conversation, for example. I don't think I'm doing the explanation justice, but I swear I'm more articulate in my book. So the problem with things like masking, having sensory problems and being very overloaded sensory-wise, like consistently, having communication issues, which is another big diagnostic trait or criteria that a lot of us deal with. You have a lot of misunderstandings, you rub people the wrong way, you don't know why, no one bothers to explain it to you, they just get angry. It means that you're dealing with a lot every single day, even if you're having a good day. So for example, if I'm having a good day, often things can still be too loud, too bright, they almost always are. Even on my best days, I can go to bed at sort of 7 p.m. with a migraine because I can't cope with anything. And that could have been a really fantastic, productive morning where I've spoken to people and done all my emails and all my other work bits, but it's still a lot to deal with. The problem comes because every day you have to deal with this stuff because society expects you to, and you don't really have a choice in the matter. So meltdowns and shutdowns come from having too much. So when you're overloaded sensory-wise and everything is too difficult and you're dealing with a lot of hard things, you can end up having a meltdown or a shutdown. So meltdowns are the ones that are more typically shown in the media. It's if you think about the very typical small child boy having problems and he's, hitting his head or throwing things or slamming around and being difficult, that's a meltdown. It's not a tantrum, it's different to a tantrum, especially in children. That's an important thing to remember, is that it's not a tantrum. A tantrum is something a child does when they want a response. So when they want something in return, they're sort of throwing a tantrum because they want something from you. And that's the best way to tell the difference. A meltdown is an uncontrollable reaction to external input that you can no longer cope with. It's an involuntary response. It's like a dam breaking. You can't cope anymore, and so the resulting response is enormous because you're at a full breaking point. In adults, this can look very different to in children, obviously, because some of us can't or won't, for many reasons, start freaking out on a bus, but then also many of us do. It really depends on your breaking point and how strong your mask is, really, how unfortunate your mask is. Because, for example, there's an instance I talk about in my book where I ended up having a meltdown or a shutdown. I'm not sure which, to be honest, because there's a lot of overlap. When I was in one of the train stations in central London, and I don't remember a lot. I just remember thinking, oh no, I've really done it this time, because I got so overwhelmed and I didn't realize until the last possible minute, because it affected my ability to think clearly, and I didn't realize how close to breaking point I was. And I self-manage sort of really strongly most of the time, to great detriment to my social life and to everything. And like it's like a full-time job trying to manage myself. So I normally keep a really good grip on it, but in this particular instance, I didn't manage it, and I was by myself in central London, and it was busy. Like a big crowd had come up on me, and all I remember is thinking, "Oh no," very clearly. Like I had like this sudden clarity of, "Oh God, something's going to happen," and then I don't remember anything. It was a bit like a blackout, and I'm not sure what happened in that interim. But I came to in a TFL break room wrapped in a shock blanket. And thank God that one of the staff members in the room had an autistic son and thought he understood what was going on, and then checked my bag, and I have a card, an identification card, and he had found that. And so he had said, like, don't call an ambulance, don't do anything, like, I'll just sit with her for a bit. And I came to sort of only 10 minutes later, and I was fine. And, you know, he put me on a train home and it was all good. But thank God that it was him specifically who found me, because if it could have been anyone else, it's such a situation. There are a lot of stories about sort of autistic men who end up having a meltdown in public, and sort of they end up sort of seeming quite violent, especially if someone tries to restrain them, and then it becomes like a whole thing, and so that's a big problem. But some autistic people, because the mask is so strong, which isn't a good thing at all, won't melt down until they get home, which means that they use even more of the energy reserves that they don't have to try and not like melt down in public, to take it home with them, which is really difficult. And then a shutdown is sort of like a meltdown. You're still feeling all of the exact same terrible emotions and feelings and lack of control and stuff. It's just internalized. So a shutdown is more like it's almost like becoming catatonic in some respects. Like you would stop responding, or you would struggle to respond, and you'd be sort of very hazy, and it just seems more withdrawn than it is more of like an explosion. So if a meltdown is an explosion, a shutdown is like an implosion, but they're both just as bad as each other, even though one looks much less extreme, if that makes sense.
That was so beautifully articulated. Continuing on with this theme of autistic traits that are showcased very much in media, special interests. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's like a defining trait of any autistic person or character
absolutely.
in a movie or TV series.
So special interests is another key diagnostic trait. I'm not sure why we have them. We just do. It's just a fun perk of being autistic. And it's having a strong passion or interest in something very specific most of the time. It's not really the same as an allistic passion or hobby or interest. It's not as casual as that. It feels very, very big to us, very important to us. And because of that, we can harness them as a tool in some respects. So for example, if I was on the brink of a shutdown on the Bakerloo line, I can open up something on my phone to interact with a special interest to try and combat some of that bad external input, and try and bring in some better. I can almost try and do a little bit of a trade-off, at least to get myself home, and then I can maybe melt down or whatever I need to do when I get home. But I'm not sure how to convey how important they are to us, but they're so important, and it's really important that people don't discourage them, especially in children, because if you encourage a special interest in a child and you help foster that and grow that with them, when they become older, that passion and that sort of, it's a skill almost. I don't know how to, I feel like it's kind of like a skill. They'll be able to use that to their advantage and to help keep themselves feeling sort of balanced and focused and stable, and when things are really hard. They vary for everyone. You can have one big special interest for life. You think the cliche is trains, for example, or you could have multiple special interests all at once. You could have 3 or 4 or 5 even. We don't know because no one studies anything properly about autism, really. The funding seems to go to other places rather than the things we live with and deal with. And so we have no answers really for any of it. We just kind of try and work it out together, a bit like a big community mind map, I guess. A special interest could be prevalent for 15 years and then suddenly you could lose interest for a while. That's a thing. And then it can come back again. There's really no rules. So it's quite hard to explain to allistic people, because I think if you're autistic, you can feel when it's a special interest. It's a feeling. So when I engage with my special interest, I can feel it like in my chest. I don't know how else to say it. Like it feels, I can feel it. Yeah, they're really important to us. It's really important that they're not sort of dissuaded, or especially that children aren't punished for them, for example. And a lot of adults have made successful careers out of special interests, although they shouldn't have to. That shouldn't be the expectation, obviously. They should be able to just be an interest if that's the case. But they're a really imperative part of our lives, I think. I'm not sure how to talk about them, but I think I do a better job of that in my book too.
Could you maybe tell us a little bit about stimming, which I think is perhaps another thing that we see, but allistic people don't really understand?
This is one of the ones where even in more modern or current sort of TV shows and stuff they make about autism, this is one that is still handled so badly in some respects that it confounds me, because we know now for a fact, like this is a common fact within the community and within anyone who engages with anything about autism, is that stimming is really important. So it really surprises me in current shows that they still spend so much time like focusing on the parents and how they're horrified by the stimming and stuff, because first of all, myself and a lot of autistic people always just think it's really not that big of a deal. Like, so your kid likes to jiggle their leg or rock back and forth, like wow, it's the end of the world. It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But stimming is a really fundamental part of our existence. Like special interests, it's a skill for coping. They're all coping mechanisms, and special interests and stimming, I think, almost deserve to be on like equal footing with each other, at least in my experiences. So because of sensory overload, which I mentioned a bit earlier, I'm not sure how well I explained it, but because our senses are always so overstimulated, or we can also be understimulated, basically our senses are always just doing off their own thing and our brains can't keep up with it or process it properly. It means that we're always very much at odds with our sensory input, which is a really difficult thing to not only explain but also experience. If you don't have sensory issues, then it can be difficult to try and potentially wrap your head around maybe. But it's almost like if you have a really bad headache or a migraine and you think, oh, my eyeballs hurt, my ears are aching, like my whole head is on fire. That's kind of what dealing with sensory difficulties is a bit like, is that your senses are always off doing their own thing. Like you might touch your favorite sweater and today it feels wrong and you're not sure why, but that's just a part of your life. But it also means things like going to the supermarket is very overwhelming because of all the sights, the sounds, the smells, the colours, the fluorescent lights. You can hear them in a lot of cases, and it's awful. And so stimming is short for self-stimulatory behaviour, and it's a method or a tool or a skill and an instinct, if not anything else, that we can use to create better input for ourselves. So you can rock back and forth, for example, or you could touch soft fabric, and you could use that to combat some of the negative input that you're taking in. So it's really important, again, like special interest, that it's not dissuaded in children, because that's, especially as a child, that's a key skill they're exploring and developing to help them cope later in life or just with life in general. I find it really disappointing that mainstream media still continually seems to sort of like dissuade stimming and sort of paint it in such a bad light, because it's imperative. If you stop a child from stimming, all you're doing is robbing them of their ability to cope with the world.
It's very much a thing where it's a problem for people who aren't autistic, as opposed to being an issue for autistic people.
Exactly.
If you could imagine a world that was accommodating for autistic people, where you could go out and it wouldn't be as awful as it might be right now, what would that world look like, do you think? What can people do to make the world a little bit better, a little bit more accommodating, to some extent, for autistic people?
So I guess the main thing that I immediately went to was less judgment. if people could maybe step out of their bubbles and stop sneering at people in the supermarket for one thing or something, or because they hear a noise they didn't like, or because they saw a movement they thought was strange, or just because they accidentally got in your way. It's possible they accidentally stepped on your foot because they're absolutely like floored by the sensory input in the room. A big one for me is the supermarket. I think that's why I keep coming back to it. It's literally like my own personal hellscape that I have to go to once a week. I often become so overwhelmed in the supermarket that I come home, I go on a Monday, I come home every Monday from it, and I have to lie down or I have to sit in the dark, and I get like a genuine migraine constantly. And it's like, and it can often have a rollover effect onto my Tuesday, just because the fluorescent lighting that is so common everywhere nowadays. A lot of shops, supermarkets, coffee shops, clothing stores, they all seem to play a lot of loud music now. Like, I'm not sure when it became a trend to play like club hits in supermarkets and stuff, but like, I do not support it. It's a thing that seems so simple, like, oh, it's just a bit of music to liven up the supermarket. But that lack of consideration for people who might have a headache or might be autistic or might be dealing with things is one small thing that you can do to make other people's lives easier. So I'm speaking from an autistic standpoint, obviously, like, it's horrible, but even if someone did just have a headache, like, that must suck for them. That someone has made that bold choice for everyone involved just to, I don't know. So the things that people can do is just be less judgmental, just be kinder. I see a lot of people on social media say things like, "I'll be kinder to the mums who are fighting with their kids in the supermarket, or if their kid is having a tantrum on the floor, like, you don't know if they're autistic," which is a really good and important point. Like, no one should be judging other people for how they handle their kids, kind of thing anyway. But there's not a lot of awareness for the strange behavior of adults when they're dealing with things by themselves in public. And a lot of us are relatively independent, so we do deal with things by ourselves. We are out by ourselves. And people are very judgmental very quickly. There's almost no room left for not being judgmental anymore. You're just an inconvenience immediately to everyone around you somehow, even though you don't know them and you don't actually really factor into anything they're doing. The fact that you're existing near them in a way that makes them uncomfortable is enough for them to be sort of angry and passive aggressive and quite sort of unkind. The more specific things people can do would just be things like dimming the lights slightly. The world is a very bright place. Less loud music in public spaces, especially in coffee shops. I don't really understand it, because surely in a coffee shop you're reading or you're working or you're meeting a friend to talk, and they're playing really loud music, which has never made any sense to me, because how does anyone do anything in a coffee shop when it sounds like that? But to be honest, it would just be things like monitoring the input. If you're setting up the music for somewhere, or you're setting up the lighting, or even if you're fragrancing somewhere, just take a moment and think, okay, how would this feel for someone who had stronger senses? Like, would this be a lot to deal with? And the answer is probably almost always yes. A nice way for holistics maybe to be able to think about it, and the technique that I have often used, is that if I'm struggling with input in a place, I tell someone I have a migraine. I'll say, "Oh, I'm migraine prone, can you turn the music down?" Because that's easier than trying to explain to a random person that I'm autistic, especially because a lot of people don't seem to realize that we have the sensory issues, even though they're such a big part of our lives and probably the main part of the criteria. You get things done a lot quicker if you just say, "I have a migraine." They don't question it. They just go, "Oh no, I'm so sorry," and they turn it down. But if I say, "Oh, I'm autistic, can you turn it down?" They're like, "Why does that mean I need to turn it down?" So it's, just being more mindful, being kinder, less judgmental would be a big help for a lot of people, I think, autism aside.
Absolutely. I think empathy is something that can make the world a better place for pretty much everyone, but also I can definitely imagine how it would be helpful for autistic people as well. You have some great quotes in your book from other books, and we like that because we're a library. And you talk about how certain stories like Sherlock Holmes and books have sort of overall helped you and been a source of comfort and strength because you could relate to those characters. I also think fiction is quite a good way to learn empathy, to see and experience perspectives that we might not have ourselves. And I do think actually many people's first interactions with autistic people are either from TV movies or actually with fictional autistic characters. Are there any books about autism, whether that's fiction or non-fiction, or just books that feature autistic people in a realistic way that you think are must-reads for autistic or allistic people alike? And if you tell us, we can put them in the information box below so everyone watching can have a read down there as well.
So I haven't read that much autistic fiction. I think often in a lot of fiction, especially if the author is not autistic, which is more common than not, I think it's getting better now, but for a long time, books about autism were not written by autistic people, which is an obvious problem. Because it's all hypothetical, and in a lot of cases they don't have a sensitivity reader or anything, and that's obviously an issue. So a lot of the books, I do have recommendations. The books that I have read are non-fiction, and they're mostly, because I was an undiagnosed adult, so they're mostly books written by other autistic adults that have come out in more recent years. So the first one I read after I got, oh, my earphones are dying. The first book I read was Odd Girl Out by Laura James. I lost the dust cover, but it's got a pink cover normally. And that was a woman's account of late diagnosis when she was a lot older than I am, and that was really interesting. Another book I read recently was by Katherine May, and that's called The Electricity of Every Living Thing. I couldn't find it to show it to you. It's in my bookcase somewhere. It swallowed it. But that was really good. I really enjoyed that. I found that really helpful to read. I think I only read it last winter, and even though I felt that I was relatively come to terms with my diagnosis and stuff at that point, I still found that I took a lot away from it. And those two books are really good examples of an autistic adult sharing how that affects sort of their families and stuff, their partners and their children, and how they came to terms with such a late diagnosis. So I think that's a really important read for everyone. Autistic adults could definitely take a lot away from it, as I did, but I think also it would be really good for autistic people to read about how someone could come to terms with their diagnosis that late, but also to understand how someone can go so long without knowing what the problem is, not problem, but what the situation is, not knowing why they are the way that they are. I found them both to be really poignant reads, even though they're both very different books. And then the other one that I have is Our Autistic Lives, which is like an anthology of experiences or accounts from autistic adults around the world. And it's from ages 20 to 70 plus. So I think that's really good because autistic adults exist. This is the thing that I think maybe I should have mentioned back in the misconception part, where we said what the most harmful things were. And somehow a lot of people still don't seem to realize that autistic adults exist. And that's a big problem because we grow past childhood. And we're still struggling and we still need help, and it's not there for us. And there seems to be sort of quite a good bit of understanding for children, but not a lot for adults. But this was really interesting, and it covered a wide range of people, which was fascinating. And then NeuroTribes is not written by an autistic author to the best of my knowledge, but it's written by Silberman. And it's just a fantastic account of autism from the birth of the word to modern day. It's fascinating, the stuff that it goes through. It's also really big, but it is really worth it if you can get through it. For me, it was fascinating to come to terms with and to know the history of my label, I guess. And then the last one that I have is the Stim Anthology, which was edited by Lizzie Huxley-Jones, and I contributed to this one with illustrations in the middle of the book. But it's an anthology of fiction and non-fiction accounts written by autistic people, so that's really interesting.
Brilliant. I will definitely put those in the information box below for anyone who is interested. So you are actually predominantly an illustrator and artist. And in your book, you write, "I make because I have nothing else and because it is all I need." And when I read that line, I felt something. It was a very kind of moving statement. Could you talk a little bit about your work? You know, what kinds of things do you draw? What does it mean for you? What do you illustrate? Do you have like a particular like a style that you kind of feel yourself drifting towards?
Again, because I grew up undiagnosed and I had no idea what the deal was, but I knew there was something going on. A coping technique or an outlet for everything, for emotion and for difficulties and stuff from a very young age was drawing. But also sort of collecting things and sort of thinking about things and approaching things in my own way. From a really young age, I was like collecting stuff up into notebooks, sort of like for no reason, but it was for a reason. I just didn't know what it was. It all seemed very strange, I think, to the adults around me, but I was obsessed with collecting things up and sort of documenting things very profusely. And now obviously that I have my diagnosis and I know that I process things differently, simultaneously somehow I process things too fast and too slow in some respects. I always sort of joke with my other autistic friends that my head is simultaneously too full and too empty. It's so full and I have so much going on that it feels empty because it's too much to even sort of comprehend in some ways. So a big part of how I know I process things as an adult is writing things down or drawing them or getting them out of my head so that there's more room in my head for other stuff. It's like a hard drive that's too full that you have very little control over. And obviously as a child, it was the same. It's still the same brain, it's still the same head now. And so things were exactly the same as a child. I just had no idea how to identify those at the time. But I was drawing and writing and collecting information from a very young age. And so when I was in school, I did not do very well because we didn't know I was autistic, and obviously I had no support for that, and I was struggling with a lot of things in very abstract ways. It seemed, obviously they don't seem abstract now, but to all the adults and teachers and sort of mentors and stuff in my life, it all seemed a bit strange and none of it made any sense. And they had no idea what to do with me, and I don't hold it against them because I must have truly seemed like an apathetic lost cause, but that wasn't the case. And so I didn't perform well in high school or anything, and I barely scraped into college. And I got into art because I didn't have enough of the core STEM subject, like grades, to be able to do anything else ultimately. So it's really lucky that it panned out for me because I didn't have a lot of choices left. And then I went to university for illustration after that, after some encouragement from one of my tutors at college. And I pursued illustration, and I learned about illustration and sort of communicating visually in whatever way suits you kind of thing. So the way I think they explained it to us was just that anything is illustration, because illustration is just saying something with what you're doing. And I was like, oh, that's really nice, because that means that it's not strict. And I think some people do have a stricter view of illustration, like very traditional illustration. But there is also room in the industry, I think, for a more sort of like a vague approach in some respects, because I know for me personally that writing has always also been a big part of the way I draw, hence why I ended up accidentally making a book and not a graphic novel. It's always been very mixed for me. Everything has always been very intertwined in my life, and I think with everything that I do somehow I'm not sure how to explain it, but it means that. So I mostly focus on illustrating things that I experience. To come back to your original question, I collect the things that I see and I feel and I experience to help myself process them, I think. And so a lot of my illustration seems a bit mundane, maybe. It's very everyday things. I like to draw people on the Bakerloo line. That's a big hobby of mine. I really enjoy that. And I like documenting my experiences, which is how my book came about, because I was trying to explore how to draw autistic feelings, and then it evolved into a book by accident. So a lot of my work is based around quite mundane topics, I think, really. And I'm not sure how to describe my style. It just kind of happened. I was at university and my tutor kept saying to me, like, stop focusing so hard on trying to find your style and just draw things. Like, look at the things around you and draw them. And that's what I started trying to do. And then eventually it turned out he was right, begrudgingly, and that worked for me. And now when I want to draw things, I just try to draw them, and then it happens eventually.
I feel like that's a good segue into my next question, which was basically, what was your process like sort of self-publishing this book? Was it kind of therapeutic and fun to kind of collect, compile and research and put it all together? Was it quite difficult doing it through kind of the self-publishing route, or was it kind of liberating and it meant that you had full control over everything?
So this is funny because throughout the book I call it a zine, which I don't know if it has a technical term, but basically it's just like a short publication that you make with an intention to say something. And so I started making my book with the intention of making a small zine about my experiences. And then as I started to work it out and I sort of got the visual language down and I started thinking about the things I wanted to say, I realized that there were more and more and more topics that I wanted to cover, especially because words and images come so hand in hand for me in a lot of the case. So I was writing just as much as I was drawing, which seems counterintuitive, but that's how I work, apparently. And so I was tackling these topics and they were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the beginning, I kept saying to my mum, oh, I think I need to cut this chapter back because there's too much there. And then I was visiting other chapters and ideas. And then I got to a point where I was like, this is ridiculous. If I'm going to do this, I don't want to sort of censor the information I'm giving out. I want to give out as much information as I can. So if there's an experience I can share, or if there needs to be more facts and more statistics, then I should do that. And if there needs to be more words, then so be it, and it doesn't matter. And then once I sort of had that revelation, it grew and grew and grew and grew until it got to its like 160 something pages that it is, I think. which one of my friends said was the most mean thing she's ever heard, because I accidentally got carried away with what was meant to be a small project. And it ended up totally out of hand, but it paid off. And I self-published it because I don't know how to publish things properly. And I've always run an online shop through my website. I've sold prints and stuff, and even sort of a few years ago I made like a really tiny A6, like very baby zine about autism when I first got diagnosed, and it's really like funny to laugh back at now because it's so bad. But I sold that through my shop back then too, and then to compare that to my book is very surreal. So I accidentally started making a book, and then because I have like a small following online, I said, hey, is anyone interested in this book or zine I'm making? Turns out a lot of people were. So I said, okay, I'll sell it through my shop like I always do, and I use a specific manufacturer for my zine, so I already had that nailed. And then I printed one run of my book, and it sold out in like 30 minutes. So I had to restock it immediately because so many people were emailing me angry, and order another run from my manufacturer, and then that all sold out too. And then so I've just been restocking and selling them since. So I'm really lucky that self-publishing worked really well for me, because I do everything on a bit of a whim. It's really lucky that it panned out.
I think it's not just luck though, I think it is the fact that it is so well researched, well written and well illustrated as well. I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit. You seem to think it's all luck, but really looking at it, it seems like this is something that comes across very effortless, but I can see that there's lots of kind of work and graft that's gone into it, and I think it really pays off. I think it is such a beautiful thing, which you can borrow from the library, or if you're not part of the North Harrow Community Library, you can join up. If you're not in the Harrow Borough, you can buy from Megan's website, and I'll put the link for that below as well. One final question which we ask everyone, and it's a question that's very close to our hearts. Why do you think libraries are important?
I would almost say that they're like unquestionably important, because how could they not be? I mean, to go back to I guess the theme of the whole interview, growing up undiagnosed and being sort of not presenting autistic very typically, and being considered like a smart but not quite right kid, I guess. Libraries were a big part of my childhood, to be honest, because I struggled to make friends, and I struggled even more to keep friends. But I read from a really young age. That was one of like the only things that I picked up really fast, was reading. And especially when I found Sherlock Holmes, which is one of my main special interests. I found that when I was like, I don't know, 9 years old maybe, and that was like it. I was like gone. But my whole childhood I found a lot of comfort in books and in fictional worlds, and in being able to put the rest of the world away, especially because I found it so difficult to deal with. But I could pick up so many books from the library, and I could read so many books in a weekend or in a week, or that like libraries are everything. If nothing else, they're still one of the only remaining free community spaces that people can visit and enjoy, that they can find that respite and that comfort and that quiet, and you know what I mean? Like, it's a safe space that all communities need. And children and everyone, people deserve to be able to read books, even if they can't afford to buy them. It's really important that books and knowledge and information and experiences aren't gatekept. So I have many feelings about libraries. I think they're really, really important. And community is important. I mean, the first place that change takes place, for example, maybe for everything, like in approach to, okay, hang on. So when I contacted you about donating my book, it was because I thought, okay, well, I know there isn't a lot in Harrow, which is where I live too, for autistic adults. Not that I can find trace of online anyway. There are some support groups, but they're a lot further away. They're not actually in Harrow. So we don't have a lot of local support or anything really, resources, I guess, for autistic adults who, I don't know, just there doesn't seem to be a lot, as far as I could research. If anyone watching knows different, please let me know. But I couldn't find a lot online, and I've been researching on and off for years. I come back to it sort of every 3 or 4 months, checking and double checking. So when I contacted you about donating my book, I was really excited that you said you wanted to take it and that you really believed in your library being an inclusive place. I was absolutely thrilled. It was the best response I could have hoped for, because a lot of people are uncomfortable when talking about autism, especially if the idea that we're talking about conflicts with their very typical idea of it. So whenever I've reached out to places, I have no idea how it's going to go down, and it's quite nerve-wracking. The response online from people has been really good, but then to talk to people in real life is a whole nother level of scary, especially if you have issues communicating, which I do because I'm autistic. And so because now my experiences and this information about autism is in a library and people can find it. I don't know, I feel like I'm making a mess of it verbally, but I just think libraries are really important for information and for sharing experiences and for growing communities and to keeping people up to date with information.
Yeah, you've verbalized everything that we feel about this library as well. I do think a library is a place that sort of opens its arms and welcomes everyone through the doors. I think we tend to be one of the few unjudgmental kind of places. We are aware that people are different. We're aware that people come in from all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of places. And a library is for all. It doesn't ask you anything when you walk in. It kind of says, well, here's your library card. If you could return your books, that'd be great. But you know, you do you. So yeah, absolutely. We very much believe in having an inclusive space at North Carolina Community Library. Megan, this has been absolutely illuminating, and thank you so much for your time. You can find Megan's book on her website if you would like to buy it, but you can also borrow it from our library. You just need a membership card, which is free. So come sign up and browse our lovely books. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we will see you in the library soon.